Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for rejoining after the coffee break. Hope you've refueled. Please take a seat. We're going to kick off with the next panel. Before we do so, just a quick thank you again to our sponsors who make this all possible. Without them, we wouldn't be here today in person again. And it's great to see everyone's face. So, on to the next panel. Alluded to it earlier, and we've had a lot of talk about hubs, sub-hubs, and different markets that are emerging and the drivers behind that. We're going to dive in now into connectivity hubs, and we've got an array of panelists that cover pretty much everywhere in the region, so they'll be able to give insights. I'm going to hand over to the esteemed moderator for this session, Sean Bergen. Please, gentlemen, take to the stage.
Come on up, guys. I'll introduce you once you sit down.
Okay, all right.
Why not? Well, you can, or you can confuse people and just sit under someone else.
That will be the first question. What's wrong?
Yes, that's right. No, thank you all for attending. I know there's only this session and one more. Then you're having drinks. So we'll make sure we keep it interesting and worth your while for attending. Firstly, I'd like to welcome our panellists. With me, I have Robert Ho, who's the director, not managing director, but the director of marketing and development for Digital Realty. Robert, thanks for coming. Have Ivo Ivanov, he's the CEO of DECX International. Welcome. We have Chris Thorpe, who's the founder and CEO of Leading Edge Data Centres. Hello. And we have Wengyu Wong, who's the founder and managing director of Extreme Broadband. And finally, right up the end there, can barely see you without my glasses down there, Chris Wilson, who's the co-founder and CEO of Verge Digital Infrastructure. What's very interesting about the makeup of this panel, you consider that there's a lot of founders of data centre businesses on the stage, which sort of tells me that the industry is still growing quite extensively. So it takes courage to found anything. But in the digital infrastructure space, it's even more challenging than most. So should be an interesting panel. So there's been a lot of talk over the last 48 hours about hubs. But I think what we're going to try and focus on today is the connectivity hubs. So it's not just about where the data centres are, it's also about where the submarine cables interconnect and provide that connectivity as a hub. Different concept. So I think we should really talk about which countries stand out as having the most promise from a DC and connectivity point of view. Obviously, we'll talk about Singapore a little, but I think we can talk about that in a variety of ways. We want to talk about the hurdles and challenges with some of these emerging hubs. I think I heard it called a sub-hubs before, which is an interesting term. And finally, we're going to talk about business models, and is there anything innovative coming through that helps us all establish these hubs or sub-hubs. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Robert the first question, if I could. So for the markets that Digital Realty are not currently in, what countries are standing out for you as having the most promise?
Oh, I get to go first. Okay, thank you. For Digital Realty, I mean, so I look after the new markets and explore, what markets we need to go into. So currently, we're executing on India. Next is, I think, that is very promising is obviously Indonesia, and then Vietnam. I think the macroeconomics of these locations speak for themselves. That is a must execute. And I'm pretty sure all these gentlemen, fine distinguished gentlemen on the panel here, will agree with me in those markets. So it's just a matter of time, priority, and when to execute.
Okay. So beyond say Indonesia, India, are you seeing anything in Vietnam? Are you seeing anything exciting in other countries in that neck of the woods?
Yes. In all parts, because I mean, we all know the statistics about Southeast Asia. CAGR growth is just phenomenal. Probably tops in the world, more so than North America, more so than in EMEA, The CAGR growth projected in the next 5 years is just, even though the sheer numbers are less, but the CAGR growth percentages are just phenomenal.
Okay, so Chris Wilson, get down to the end there. So most of the focus for data centre development is in major cities, obviously, in most cases. So do you expect that to change, or how do you see that changing over the coming years as capital cities become arguably single points of failure? What's going to happen?
Yeah, great question. And first off, I completely agree with Robert in terms of the key markets in Southeast Asia where I'm focused. Very much Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand. I think they're the three where we're focused, and where clearly in Thailand and Indonesia there's already a bunch of moves being made. I think in Vietnam we're going to see those moves being made very soon. So I think those are the right three core markets in Southeast Asia. Going back to Sean, your original perspective of connectivity hubs, I think in two of those cases they're also connectivity hubs. I think Thailand and Indonesia are also emerging as places where cables are being built, connectivity is being established, which will broaden the resilience of connectivity within Southeast Asia. But coming back to the specific question about different cities, I think in each of those cases, the focus first will be on the capital cities. I think we're seeing that in Jakarta, we're seeing that in Bangkok, we will see that Ho Chi Minh and a bit around Hanoi. But I think that's going to evolve pretty quickly. I think within sort of the next 2 to 3 years, we'll start to see people looking at tier 2 cities in those locations. Indonesia is a very big place with many very big cities. Vietnam is a very long, thin country with, so you can't really serve the population in the north from a data center in the south. Thailand also has big sort of population centers. So I think we will see, in that sort of 2 to 3 year time span, I think we'll start to see, the edge moving into those tier 2 cities. And I think the challenge for many of us here is to work out, it's given that it takes time to build those facilities, how do we time the construction so that we're ready when the demand hits?
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, because if you consider a city like Medan in Indonesia, I think it's got a population larger than Australia as a city, right? Yet I couldn't, well, Thorpe, you might know, how many data centres are in Australia?
How many data centres in Australia?
Sorry, I didn't mean to throw a test at you. Roughly, broadly.
I think you've got circa about sort of 70 to 80 data centres. Depends on what sort of scale you're talking about. But it would be into the hundreds when you start talking about on-prem.
If you consider that, and you look at a place like Medan, who's got pretty much zero, it's an interesting market to contemplate, right? So yeah, all right. Well, thanks, Chris. That's interesting. So you pretty much think the move's going to be away from decentralisation more than anything else, serving those smaller markets. Does that also help address the DR issue?
I think so. I mean, I think Singapore is the hub for all things in Southeast Asia, and I don't think that's going to change. But I think there will be a lot of decentralization and distribution in connectivity going forward. I think everyone is worried now about Singapore as a single point of failure. The Malacca Straits is a single point of failure from the subsea cables. And to an extent, the moves into Johor and Batam, to create the sort of the greater Singapore are important, but they don't actually fundamentally address some of those single points of failure. So I think we are going to see, particularly in connectivity, a more distributed architecture. I think what's happening in the south of Thailand, where we're very much focused at the moment, is important, because a lot of cables are landing in Satun and in Songkhla. And historically, there's been very little sort of interconnect in the south of Thailand. There have been cables that sort of pass in the night. But I think we're seeing, Hat Yai emerging as a key switching point, a key connectivity point for Southeast Asia, which provides some protection and redundancy around potentially failures in Singapore.
It's a good point. Weng might disagree with you a little bit. I think got Malaysia on his mind there. As a Malaysian player, what are the market developments that contribute to the increased competitiveness of Malaysia? I think that's an important thing that most people think about when they think about Malaysia, is the competitiveness of it relative to other markets.
I think for Malaysia, similar to many other countries, data center business is a rapidly expanding segment in the telecommunication market. Recently, there have been an influx of activities in building dark fiber networks all around Malaysia, and typically this is along the telecommunication corridors, the north-south backbones. And it's interesting that Chris mentioned about, the southern Thailand, there's a lack of interconnectivity activities. So Malaysia, we have come out with our own solutions as well. Recently, there have been an announcement of the establishment of a data center at the border between Malaysia and Thailand. So this is a new location pioneered by the government of Malaysia. The location offer not only multiple 100 megawatt power capacities, it also has green energies available there. And now the very fact that it's established at the border, it allows Thai players to bring, the capacity from the submarine cable landing into Satun and Songkhla into Malaysia, and to start offering their capacity to the Malaysian operators. So I think these are some of the encouraging developments in Malaysia, and I do believe that over time Malaysia will prevail as one of the more competitive connectivity hub in the regions.
It's an interesting concept, because if you're coming, a lot of new cables coming out of India, they're all coming to Singapore via the Malacca Strait. As Chris mentioned, it's a point of failure. The Malacca is a very narrow stretch of water. But most of these cables are also branching into Satun. So it provides the opportunity via Hat Yai to come terrestrially straight down into Malaysia, KL, through Malaysia, down to the causeway here, and provide a redundant path for the subsea segment through the Malacca Strait.
Yes.
So I think that's hitting the nail on the head in the context of what this panel's about, which is the emerging hubs. And I think that bridge across Thailand, even into the Gulf, into Songkhla, and coming down to Singapore, creates that bridge and that diverse link down to Singapore that's probably missing with the Malacca Strait.
Yeah. If I may also add that, the definition for connectivity hub is not only to serve the domestic market. No doubt, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, they have a big market. Populations is huge. But if you look at the success of Singapore as a connectivity hub, almost all the traffic is for regional distributions. So the way I see the next emerging hub, it should exhibit a similar characteristics too. It needs to be able to serve regional populations instead of just the domestic eyeballs.
Yeah, okay. Ivo, how do you guys look at the region now in the context of connectivity?
Yeah, thank you. And if you might know, we do run internet exchanges, interconnection platforms only. So we are not in the data center business. Data centers are our partners, natural partners. We're not a carrier. So look into a question here from a pure connectivity aggregation point of view. And there is a very simple logic answering the question, where will be the next hub? The question is not if. The question is where and how and when. And the logic which gives the answer is a logic based on applications. The applications today for businesses and private users, but also even more the applications of the future. We will see very soon lifetime or real-time HD streaming on sports events, for instance, right? Or entertainment in general in real time. We talk about online gaming in real-time communities in the highest resolution possible. We talk about real-time manufacturing control and automation and connected cars with autonomous driving functionality, etc. All this tells us that these applications, they cannot be run properly without the best latency possible. Right? And if we think in that path further, we realize that the infrastructure and the content serving these applications, the cloud serving these applications, they need to get as close as possible where the users are. As we all know, the vast majority of cloud zones and application providers are based today still in Singapore. But the millions and over millions of users are not in Singapore. So that's the simple logic. We need to see this distribution of content, of cloud, and also the distribution of infrastructure related to the service to all these customers and service providers of a data center, of an internet exchange, of a carrier. So no doubt, and if I use my hand here, you see if Singapore is here, we have 5 fingers, and those are the next big hubs here. They will not replace Singapore, they will become important and very strong next to Singapore. And obviously Jakarta, Manila, Bangkok, we talk about KL, we talk about, of course, Ho Chi Minh, Hanoi, but beyond this, a further distribution across the countries I just mentioned will be needed. The capitals will not do the trick at all further the path, and we will need to see really edge connectivity, edge distribution, even of small edge data centers, carrier services, internet exchange services. We at Digix are working on concepts to serve, probably not tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow, the needs of a highway crossroad in terms of mini internet exchange.
It's an interesting concept because Industry 4.0 is what's driving a lot of this activity. And I think it plays right into the edge data center space. And I think, Chris, in your case...
Yeah, absolutely. Everything you were saying there, totally agree. If you look at Australia, I mean, that's where we're actually building out an edge data center network. And we're building out 26 edge data center locations across regional Australia. And you look at the, resilience and redundancy was talked about a lot before, mentioned a lot before. You look at the subsea cable structure in Australia, you've got cables coming into Perth, I think it's 4 or number 5 into Perth. There was an issue last year, a super tanker started dragging anchor, cut one of the cables, grazed the second cable. It's only a 2-kilometre exclusion zone. It's nuts, but that could have been, they could have cut 50% of Australia's internet just in one issue there. And then you've got all the rest of the cables coming into Sydney. Now you look at the distribution of the cloud, the major cloud providers, predominantly they're all in Sydney. But you've got this massive continent, virtually the size of North America, but you've got the cloud just living in one spot. So if you start to go to, Mildura or up sort of far north, New South Wales, Queensland, sort of out into these smaller population centres, the number one challenge that everybody has is connectivity. And it's so unreliable. You could be sitting there with 5G, full bars, you've got broadband, everything's good, sitting there watching Netflix, suddenly you're looking at spinning disc because something has gone wrong from where you are all the way back to Sydney. And everything's tromboning back and forth. So it's putting a lot of traffic through aging fibre infrastructure that hasn't had any sort of major investment for virtually sort of 2 decades. So what we're doing is we're giving the ability for that compute power to go out into the regions. We're connecting into the existing exchange hubs, and we're connecting into the NBN point of interconnects as well. So that gives us the ability to break traffic out. Gives us the ability to cache content at these locations, making everything a lot faster, cheaper, and way more efficient. So we're a little bit different with our model because we're actually a telco and we're a data center operator. So we're effectively creating a meshed connectivity network with tier 3 facilities in all these locations.
A question to both Chris's actually, because it's not a dissimilar model. In terms of Chris Wilson's business Verge, they're focusing on tier 2 cities in Asian markets, staying away from the capitals. You're doing a very similar thing in the context of Australia. How do you guys determine what markets to hit? Because you are hitting secondary markets, some cases tertiary markets. So how do you determine which markets to go after? Is it based purely on population, or are there some other magic things you look for?
Population For us, yeah, population is the first point that we look at. We look at what local industry, what infrastructure exists there today, and very rarely is there a data center at all. So it's really sort of a range of assessments, as in what industry, what sort of target market is actually there, and how attractive is that market for, say, a cloud provider to actually launch there.
Chris?
Yeah, very similar. When we talk to our customers, it's all about population. It's about eyeballs. I think the only slight twist for us is that we also look at the telecom connectivity piece of it. So, Hat Yai may not have been the first city to choose in Thailand from a population perspective, but from a connectivity perspective, a subsea cable perspective, it's the right place to go first for us. Similarly, we also look at the architecture of the mobile companies, where they have their key interconnect points and try and match that. But fundamentally, yes, it's about population and eyeballs.
So, okay, that's talking about tier 2 cities largely, but I think I just want to drag it back to connectivity again. So if the lights went off in Singapore tomorrow, hopefully they don't. Well, there's a probability they will because they're struggling with power here, aren't they? But if all the cables got cut tomorrow, and they had to pick an alternate site to Singapore to develop to the same extent Singapore has developed, where would it be? Do we need to consider things like sovereignty of data? Does that place challenges on countries like Indonesia? Does it make Thailand more flexible? Does it make the Philippines more flexible? So imagine we literally had to rip up all the infrastructure and move it to another country within Southeast Asia. Which country would that be? I'd just like to go down the line.
The ranking, most probably Indonesia is the next one, given the size of the market, the number from internet exchange point of view, number of ASNs, even if you look into this over the 2000 and the huge number of people in this country.
But Indonesia, the reason Singapore is successful is because of its regulatory environment, okay, largely, and how easy it is to deal with the IMDA. One-stop shop, one phone call, off you go. Indonesia, not so much. Fisheries, telecoms, list keeps going. So it's, to my mind, I'm not convinced it's a natural place for a hub. Geographically it is. You could say Batam is, right? But I think to become a hub, there are certain key metrics you have to have, right? And I think a friendly regulatory framework is one of them.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And we're saying that these are not perfect environments. In all of those countries we just mentioned here, their restrictions different from the flexibility Singapore shows today. And along with the geographical standing and positioning, along with the huge population in all these markets, changes are needed. These are at the same time the challenges these markets have. Otherwise, they would be already hubs, right? Obviously. But again, based on the existing landscape, my answer was Indonesia, not taking primarily into account the regulatory environment, which is a challenging one in Thailand to a certain degree, in Malaysia. So all these countries, they have their challenges with regulatory framework.
So rather than picking on governments, I'll get back to geography a little bit. So I don't want to sort of get bogged in that. Rob, what's your view?
Oh, this is a hot tomato. Okay, so if that's a hypothetical. Hypothetical. So Singapore off the face of the earth. Okay, no connectivity. I would have to say that from Hong Kong, I would say definitely Hong Kong. Hong Kong would be the immediate replacement. Okay, for Singapore. Now you're talking about hypothetical. So we're talking about instant connectivity, get everything back up and running.
No, I'm not talking about DR in that world. I'm talking about in the context of if Singapore didn't exist, where would it be?
Okay, where would it be? Okay, in that case, then I would have to say that what you were talking about earlier, Ivo, makes perfect sense because regulatory environment is actually crucial. Open market. Access to investment, licensing, access to land, access to the legal framework, all of that matters. Because you can't do anything without a proper government approval, partnerships, right? everybody on this has to deal with this connectivity. In order to actually implement all of this, okay, we need to partner with the local governments, okay? So now, I'm not avoiding your question, okay?
Yes, you are.
Because every country that we mentioned has some challenges, okay? For sure. No place in Southeast Asia, in emerging markets, okay, has the openness that Singapore does, Hong Kong does. So as a direct replacement, if Singapore wasn't there today, okay, for the ease, the next viable one, which is relatively simple, okay, Malaysia, okay?
Right. Yep. I thought you were going to say Hong Kong.
I didn't say it's expensive, but
yeah. It's probably the next one in terms of ease of doing business, but just not necessarily the most competitive.
Yes.
Right. Wang, what's your view? You're going to say Malaysia, aren't you?
In terms of the ease of migration, definitely is Malaysia. Because I think if you look at the maturity of the market, the open access, availability in the market, I think the closest one to Singapore would be Malaysia. And on top of that, I think the vicinity to Singapore also helps. And the geographical position of Malaysia being in the center of ASEAN, it also helps. I think just now Ivo mentioned about the latency. That's also an important part because you need to place your content right in the middle of the location where you have a fair latency to all the eyeballs. So I think in all that aspect, Malaysia will prevail.
Okay. Chris? You're going to say Darwin, maybe?
It's got to be there, because, well, firstly, Malaysia, yes. I would say Malaysia would be the next sensible solution with your DR in Darwin. Because Darwin is, we've got 2 cables, maybe a third, coming into Darwin. It's the closest point to Asia, a direct line up to sort of Singapore, Malaysia. Yeah, it's a very stable environment.
Rule of law, everything makes sense there as well, I get that. Chris?
Well, of course, I'm going to have to say Thailand.
Yeah.
Look, I think, generally I don't see, and I know it was a hypothetical question, I don't see a second hub emerging anywhere. I see a distribution of connectivity around the region because I think we've moved past hubs. But to answer the hypothetical, I think, Malaysia's maybe too close to Singapore. Geographically, the east to west distance across southern Thailand is very short. So I think, there are pros and cons. But generally, I think many countries have a role to play. I think Indonesia has a big role to play. I think Malaysia and Thailand maybe together, as we were saying with, at the border, definitely has a role to play.
Yeah, I was doing the maths on the latency actually, because we are talking about connectivity hubs. And India to the US across Thailand, instead of coming down the Malacca Strait, bouncing into Singapore and across, drops off about 30 milliseconds. So it's an interesting value prop for India to come up through Thailand. I just want to throw a different perspective on this and talk more broadly about Asia before we wrap up in 10 minutes. And I'll come back to a couple of questions I have for you. So we've all seen what's happened with the South China Sea and the geopolitics. And geopolitics, to an extent, is now driving hubs, or sub-hubs, as I think they were referred to earlier. So we're seeing no new cables effectively get built in the South China Sea from Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, in that triangle that we all a lot of us have worked in forever. And now everybody's contemplating either the Great Circle route, Singapore to LA, below the Philippines, bouncing off Davao and heading across. Or they're looking to go up to Japan, around the back of the Philippines, hitting Taiwan, South Korea and Japan. So does that create an opportunity for a true second hub in Southeast Asia in the context of the Philippines or Taiwan, perhaps?
It definitely increases the attractiveness of the Philippines, especially Manila, as you mentioned correctly. A lot of projects, at least, they have been announced, or a reasonable number, at least, of investments has been announced, and makes perfect sense that politics and geographical and political decisions in terms of geopolitical positioning from certain countries, they drive, of course, investment decisions. You do not invest let's say, $50, $100, $150 million as a consortium partner if you do not have the security of the business and the case and the investment. So therefore, even business plans will be rewritten most probably to a certain degree. And given also the latest changes in some regulatory aspects on the Philippines, I'm talking about incorporation of a company with a license there, with also foreign shareholdership became a bit easier now. This goes into a positive direction for sure.
So we can't not talk about Hong Kong and all of this, okay? Because it's a hub. Ultimately, it is a hub, right? However, today it is a hub, but I would argue that status is changing quite rapidly.
So is Singapore, so is every other hub.
Yes, it is. However, what's happening with Hong Kong is obviously related to what's happening with the South China Sea, and we're seeing mean time to repair of cables in the South China Sea gone from about 3 weeks to 8 months. So the attractiveness of having a lot of assets in Hong Kong, in that context, if you're relying on traffic from Southeast Asia, is challenging. Right? So I think, you know, does Taiwan come into play there at all, or does it, you know, is it literally, do you all believe that Philippines has great potential as a secondary hub, or just IVO?
Yeah, I have a different thought about Philippines. I think geographically, Philippines has an ideal locations, but my definitions of a connectivity hubs is also require an openness in the market. So for Philippines, we have seen some encouraging developments of open peerings, the incumbent opening up, but I still think that there's a way to go. There's a distance to go, and I think given more peerings establishments in more locations, I think it will have a chance to be the alternative hub, given time.
So just dragging it back to centre here, Robert, what are the current hurdles to expansion facing digital today, in your mind?
So the hurdles for us, really, it's a macro hurdle. Okay, so you know, we build data centers, and we need massive amounts of capital. So I mean, if you think about just the general timeline, the process to actually build a data center, land acquisition, right, licensing, right, then you got to build it, and then you got to operate it, and every one of those stages, right, requires an extensive amount of money. So, and you know, especially, you know, in this environment, there poses challenges, right? And then you have to really make sure, you know, double check your homework, right? Make sure that you know, the locations that we've chosen, you know, make sense and are viable. So, those are the realistically the major, the most hardship that we have is actually making sure that our investment dollars are deployed strategically across that timeline. Because we're talking about 3 years, right? At the very least, before plan to RFS, right, is minimum 3 years.
So you know, getting back to that, then, is there a magic formula, guys, that gets used here? I think, you know, looking at some of the emails you and I've exchanged, you suggest that, you know, Digital Realty may have a magic formula.
A magic formula. Well, you just got to be the market you go in. Okay, so we're all talking about connectivity, and connectivity means partners, right? So you have to have local knowledge. You have to have local partners that can show you the landscape, and making sure that, because we don't go in there singularly, right? We don't go there as a single entity. We have to go in there and to seek partnerships in order to actually execute in the end. Because at the end of the day, you know, space and power means nothing without connectivity, right? We are trying to build an ecosystem, right? So the magic formula really, really is, like we were all saying, you alluded to earlier about, where's the next hub, right? But that question can be applied to any emerging market, right? So I think talking to anybody here on the stage, I mean, if I were to partner with DKIX, I'd do it in a heartbeat, right? Any of these gentlemen, you have to have partners and local intelligence, and experience, to deploy. So the magic formula is definitely relationships and partnerships.
Without a doubt, but on top of that, you also see some, and no one on this stage that I'm aware of. There's also a very strong element of follow me, follow the market type strategy. The OTTs are building over here, so we need to go there. So we do see a little bit of that as well. Particularly from a connectivity perspective as well.
Oh, it's certain factor, of course, related to the cloud service providers, the hyperscalers, as I said earlier, the application providers. And if we, and I will come back to my latency argument again, I prefer to say latency is the new currency for a very good reason. If we think about all the infrastructure elements we do represent even on stage today, all together that power the internet as we have today, they stay already for the largest mega project in the history of human race already. But even this will not be enough to serve the next generation of the so-called immersive internet. If we talk about the immersive internet, the metaverse, but not the product of the Meta Corporation, necessarily the concept of the immersive internet, we need to get down to the speed of our brain. And what I mean is the tactile information required to make it feel natural in the metaverse is the tactile information is less than 20 milliseconds. Video information has to be better than 13 milliseconds. And audio has to be better than 1 or not worse than 1 millisecond. So this is the speed we have to deliver to the users. So how we deliver this? Obviously with the best distribution possible, not on data centers level only, but also on the fiber. LEO satellites must be involved to a certain degree. Of course, interconnection solutions as close as possible to 5G cell towers and beyond. So this is the world. Of course, we will not probably see in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Malaysia tomorrow, but this is the world we have as an industry to prepare for in all these markets where you have, and we all see a huge concentration of users because the users will dictate the investments.
You're right, and it's funny, I had a phone call from some folks in India about 3 months ago, and they were drilling me on the latency between Chennai and Los Angeles. And they were actually going further than just POPs. They were saying, to this address, what's the latency? I'm going, look, this is way more information than anyone needs. What's the story? And he goes, well, we're planning eventually to be remotely driving cars. He said, think of a call centre in India, but instead of them on the telephone, they've actually got steering wheels and they're actually driving cars on the road in LA. That's the sort of thinking that's happening out there at the moment. And that gets back to distributed data centres, right? Not necessarily having them all in Singapore, all in one Wilshire.
Yeah, everything gets pushed to the edge. Everything needs to be pushed to the edge. So I mean, we all that's all we would be planned for, is how do we get into these emerging markets? Think about the population of Indonesia, right? I mean, my God, the amount of data that they generate is just going to be absolutely phenomenal. We have to be closer to Indonesia, if not in Indonesia, if not in Thailand, right? If not in Vietnam. So.
Well, you get 5G fixed mobile solutions rolling out through India, and wow, what's going to be required then?
That's going to be massive.
I think it's a fact that this is a must for the future. There is not question, should we? It's a question when and how.
So is there an argument, we've got to wrap up, I believe, but is there an argument that says it's too good and too easy to fail at building edge data centres? I mean, literally, what we're sort of suggesting here is they're going to succeed anyway because we need them. Everyone's shaking their head, but no one's prepared to say yes.
I think the key is obviously to pick your timing, as in pick your timing with the demand that's sort of building in market. And in Australia, the way we look at it is there were three forms of the digital divide. Initially, it was access to content. The second layer is access to cloud, which regional Australia still struggles. And then thirdly, it's, as mentioned before, with the Industry 4.0, augmented reality, virtual reality, you need single-digit latency environments. And absolutely what you were saying before, you need to get down to as close to zero as possible. And I think you're going to need compute every 50 kilometres for autonomous vehicles.
So just to wrap it up and summarise, so what I'm hearing is we think there's a range of potential sub-hubs ranging from Indonesia right through Philippines, etc., Malaysia, Thailand, Darwin, perhaps as a DR site for Southeast Asia, perhaps. What we're really saying is that the future isn't necessarily about Singapore. The future is about distributed content and distributed data centres. So the subsea industry, for example, need to think about that in terms of, do they continue to just dump all these cables into Singapore, or do they start distributing the cables in the same way that we're contemplating distributing data centres? So maybe we see more cables going to more countries instead of this consolidation into Singapore. So with that, do we have any questions from the audience?
It's more of an opinion, if you don't mind.
No, it's fine.
It's open, thanks. Thanks, Chris. Hi, my name is Claude Ashkaraktel Consulting. I've written a piece recently about the push and pull of site selection, which includes about hubs and stuff. And I would go back to your previous questions. If Singapore hypothetically were not to exist anymore, where would we go? I mean, the closest I would go is what Chris Wilson said, and that was the thesis of my paper, is that we're moving into a post-hub era. There's no more hubs, and Chris came closest to that by saying it's decentralized. And decentralized for a good reason. There is a push and pull factor. There's been, first of all, today there are 4 hubs in Asia-Pac, undisputably. Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, Sydney, okay? After that comes Seoul and so forth. But these are the 4 biggest ones. And Singapore is the biggest of the 4. And why is that? You need political stability, you need friendly regulatory and all of that. There is no way it can be Indonesia today. There is no friendly regulatory. Okay, you can't land a subsea cable in Indonesia today without difficulty. There is no way it can be Malaysia, I'm sorry, because there is no political stability. You had 4 governments in the past 5 years.
Yeah, Claude, we've got to be, if there's a question coming?
No, there's no, but that's my comments. It's a post-hub era. So the question is hypothetical, and my answer is that everything is showing there is a push out of Hong Kong for geopolitical reasons, for the South China Sea and so forth, out of Singapore for the moratorium, there is no space anymore to build anything in Singapore, and there is pull into all of those markets, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, etc., for 3 reasons. One is the local content generation. Second is the regulatory, data sovereignty, and so forth. And the third is the performance requirement leading to lower latency and therefore edge data centers.
Yeah. Thank you, Claude. And does anyone else have a question? Don't you put your hand up, Byron. No. All right, thank you very much. I'd like you all to thank the panellists, please, for their insights. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Claude. Thank you, Ivo, Robert, Weng, Chris, for coming together, and thank you for fielding that at the end. We mentioned Indonesia. We've got an Indonesia panel coming up in just a few minutes, so stick around for that. We'll delve a little bit deeper into that market. But thank you for your